Well, good evening and welcome to Chosen People Ministries Tuesday night study, where we are going through some of the messianic prophecies in the book of Isaiah. This week we're going to do the prophecy about Immanuel. I've called it Immanuel Part 2. And last week when we started, we looked at one of the proof texts for the virgin birth and a messianic title for Jesus, God with us. Now that expresses both who he is and what he does. He is Immanuel, God with us, both in his humanity and in his deity. In his humanity, he walked with us. He walked this earth. And this is why he is the compassionate high priest. He's the one who identifies with us, who understands what it is to experience the hardships of life. And the reason he's our high priest is because he was also the offering. And when we think about what Hebrews says, it's so encouraging for, it says we have a high priest who is not unable to sympathize with us in our weakness, but one who in every respect was tempted as we are and yet was without sin. So in this week's study, what I want to do is continue to look at the meaning of his name, Immanuel. But this time I'm going to do it from chapter 8. And this is where we learn more about what it means for him to be God with us. Now, in chapter 8, we're actually in the middle section of what began at the beginning of chapter 7 and goes through to chapter 9, verse 7. And these are the oracles and the prophecies concerning Messiah. Now, as our chapter opens, Isaiah is told, after he goes into his wife and she bears a son, that he's to take the name Mahar Shahal Hashbaz and write it on a large board, probably made of wood, although in the ancient world, sometimes they made small tablets of wood and they covered them with wax, and then they would use a wooden or a metal stylus to write like a pen in it. Or, of course, they would engrave into rock or into scrape onto metal. Now, as Isaiah is told to put it in a large board, like a billboard, like a great big public notice, it's likely that it was made of wood. And the name of this son means swift to plunder. And what it tells us is that the impending invasion, the invasion which will be by the Assyrians and will result in the fall of Samaria and the fall of all of the north, and it will come right down into the south, will be swift, even before the child is able to speak. And so it's in a matter of years, very few short years. And when Isaiah hears this, he goes to the king in the previous chapter and he offered him a sign. Ask of the Lord a sign. And of course, the king Ahaz, being somewhat self-reliant, self-sufficient, who wasn't walking with the Lord, says, oh, but I wouldn't dream of asking the Lord for a sign. And that kind of hid his lack of faith. But as a result, the Lord's response to King Ahaz back in chapter 7 is rather terrifying. He says that in that day, the Lord, verse 18, chapter 7, will whistle for the fly that is at the end of the streams of Egypt and for the bee that is in the land of Assyria. And then it goes on And the Lord has just said that the disaster that he's going to bring upon them will be unlike anything that has come upon them. And the land will no longer be fit for growing agricultural crops. The only thing they will be able to do is to keep cattle and sheep. And so the sign of Immanuel, the sign of hope, the promise that God would be with them, it changes to an offer of hope, to a judgment. And when we enter chapter 8, we see that the Lord is going to enter into what's happening. And the Lord is very displeased. God's people have rejected his law, and the Lord is going to come in judgment. In fact, in chapter 8, we find that the Lord speaks, and he says something very specific in verse 6. He says, because this people have refused the waters of Shiloah that flow gently, and rejoice over Rezin, the son of Remaliah. Now, if you remember, Rezin, the son of Remaliah, has allied himself with the north, the king of the north. So the king of the north and Syria ally themselves, and they are going to come up against Judah. And Rezin, who's the king of Syria, and I think it's Pekah, isn't it, who's the son of Remaliah, they are going to fight together. In fact, the Jewish commentaries say that they give kind of more credence to the king of the north rather than to Syria. But they come together, and in fact, there will come a point when they will besiege Jerusalem. But the Lord is saying something very specific. He says, you've refused the gentle river. Now, there's a spring called Gihon, which is located in the Kidron Valley, and it runs through Jerusalem, and it fills the pool of Siloam. Now, Hezekiah, who's the next king, he's going to dig great big aqueducts underneath, viaducts underneath the city, so that the water supply can't be cut off by an enemy. But what's the metaphor? The metaphor is that the waters of Shiloah are a metaphor for the voice of the Lord. And if they won't listen to the gentle voice of the Lord will bring against them a mighty roaring river, the Euphrates, and a flood will rise up. Now, it's the Assyrian army that's pictured as the river Euphrates, and it will break its banks and it will flood all of the area as it moves down through Syria, through the land of the north, until in verse 8 we read that it will sweep on into Judah, and it will overflow. The flood waters will rise, reaching even to its neck, and its outspread wings will fill the breadth of your land, O Immanuel. So we have the word Immanuel. And in this instance, in verse 8, it's clearly a name. It's not saying that God will be with us. It is a direct address to God is with us, or God with us. And that is the messianic name that is given to Jesus in the Gospels by Mary. Now, in this verse, there are multiple metaphors. And if we look at it, in verse 8, we read, it will sweep into Judah, and overflow passing even to the neck. So we have a flood water that rises to the neck of someone or something, and its outspread wings will fill the breadth of your land. Now, I've spoken about Targums before, and Targums were these Greek translations, Aramaic, sorry. If you want to put your teeth back in, the Septuagint is the Greek translation, and the Aramaic translation was also written a couple of hundred years before, couple of 1 to 2 centuries BC. And it provided Jewish people living outside of Israel access to the scriptures in a native language, although actually, while by the time of Jesus, the whole of the north of Israel are speakers of Aramaic rather than Hebrew. And that's because of the Assyrian invasion. And Aramaic was the Syrian nation's language, and it became the language of Israel. And in fact, some of the Talmud is written in Aramaic. Now, the Assyrian army, as I said, is pictured as the river which breaks its banks and floods. But the Targum reads this, and he shall pass through the house of Judah as an overflowing torrent. Unto Jerusalem shall he come, and the people of his army will fill the breadth of your land, O Immanuel. So we know that the river and the flood is Assyria, and the neck is Jerusalem. Comes right up to the top, just about to drown. And the wings are the army. And so we have these metaphors that are expressing what's going to happen. The army of Assyria will come down and fan out over the land, and it will choke Jerusalem. And that's what happens. Jerusalem will eventually be besieged. Now, one of the overarching themes of this chapter is, of course, the sovereignty of God. And it's the sovereignty of God over the earth and over the nations and the peoples who dwell in it, and unfortunately, who fight over it. But the Lord is entering this battle in judgment. And so when we read verse 8, that the outspread wings will fill the breadth of your land, O Immanuel, this is because it has been God's decision to use the Assyrians as an instrument of judgment. And while we look at this, I have to say I found it quite challenging to read personally, because I'm looking at what's happening in the land of Israel today. And Israel has been at war in Lebanon, and Israel has got the problems with Gaza, and there's rockets coming from the Houthis in Africa. And then there's Iran also financing the Hamas in Gaza, and Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the Houthis in Ethiopia. So around about Israel, all the nations are encircling it. It feels like the situation that Isaiah was facing. And he is struggling to come to terms with it himself, I believe. And I think we see that when he says later, I will wait for the Lord. And he talks about how he sees that the face of God is hidden from his people. So this instrument of judgment is coming down through Assyria. And this metaphor which changes, is of outspread wings that cover the length and the breadth of the land. And of course, it's I guess, an ironic description. There's irony here because when the people of Israel thought about birds' wings being spread out over the land, really what they would have hoped for is for it to be God's wings of protection. They would think of Exodus chapter 19 and verse 4. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you unto myself. The idea of a bird and a wing and its wings points first of all to God. But this metaphor of Assyria spreading out her wings over the land is so significant because it reveals something. It points to the loss of divine protection. Because as I've been saying, surely it should be the Lord's wings that are over his people and his land. Isaiah knew the scriptures. He knew the power of God's love at work on their behalf. But amazingly, when God speaks about himself and uses the metaphor of his wings, it's always about loving protection. Even when he punished the Egyptians, God says, I bore you on eagle's wings. He didn't say, I brought you to the land of Canaan. He said, I brought you to myself. And in Deuteronomy 32:11, God is described as the eagle that stirs up over its nest and flutters over its young, spreading out its wings, catching them and bearing them on his pinions. I'm sure Isaiah's thoughts would have gone to Isaiah 36 in verse 7. How precious is your steadfast love, O God. The children of mankind take refuge in the shadow of your wings. And this divine protection, which is so full of love, is to be valued and treasured by his people, not thrown aside the way Ahaz did, with pride and self-sufficiency, thinking, I can do it myself. I don't need to worry about the north. I don't need to worry about Syria. Why? Well, I'll make an alliance with the Assyrians. Little did he know that that alliance wasn't worth the paper it was written on, because Assyria would come and encircle them. Or even Psalm 17, keep me as the apple of your eye, hide me in the shadow of your wings. The wings of God are the image of his divine protection. And the fact that the Assyrians are pictured as a bird of prey with wings spread out is a powerful signifier of the loss of divine protection. Okay, so let me remind you of a little of the back history. So, as I mentioned earlier, Pekah, the son of Remaliah, he's the king of Israel in the north, had made an alliance with Rezin, and their armies have come to wage war against Judah. And of course, this is all happening at the very beginning of Ahaz's reign. And these two joined together ultimately to besiege Jerusalem. Now, really, what I'm supposed to be talking about is Immanuel, but it's fascinating to me that Immanuel here in this chapter comes to be with his people, even in the midst of God's divine judgment. So here is God entering the battle, as it were, and has chosen to use Assyria as an instrument of judgment. But even so, in the midst of judgment, God is there. Now, for me, when I was looking at this, it's quite a statement. And in Isaiah 8:10, the land, the wings of Assyria are spread over Immanuel's land. And quite a statement, because surely the land, in fact, the whole earth, belongs to the Lord. That's what David said in Psalm 24. And it's God who determines the boundaries and the apportioning of the nations. So, how is all of this kind of relevant? Well, Israel is called Immanuel's land. And how does that relate? How does that impact the promise that God gave the land to Abraham and his descendants in Genesis 12? Well, in Leviticus 25, verse 53, we read this: "The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. You are strangers and sojourners with me." So God is saying something. He owns the whole earth, but he's chosen this particular piece of land to give to a particular group of people, the descendants of Abraham. And so God is, in a sense, the landowner, and he's uniquely chosen and given the Jewish people the right to live there with him. And I love this connection because it's Immanuel's land. In what way is it Immanuel's land? Well, it was the place chosen for mankind to see what it means when God says and gives the name to Jesus as Immanuel, God with us. Well, it was the place chosen where he would live and walk and demonstrate in ways that could be seen and touched the meaning of God with his people. Think of John chapter 1, famous passage that we could probably all quote by heart. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. And he comes and he tabernacles with us. It's such a promise. He left the splendor and the glory of the right hand of the Father to come into the world, to be the light that shines in the darkness, to demonstrate what it means to walk and have a relationship with God. Isaiah speaking to Judah and saying, "This land belongs to me, but it also belongs to Jesus, to Immanuel." And it's the place, of course, also when we think along these lines, where the Jewish people, the tribe of Judah, the descendant of Abraham, and all the way down to Jesus, would come. God's provision of salvation. Now, in many ways, the foreshadowing of salvation that God promises to the physical land in this passage is also a foreshadowing of the greater salvation, the eternal salvation that will be wrought by Immanuel. So when Isaiah here is speaking, he's speaking to the Davidic lineage, the line of Judah. And he stresses that, in spite of this disobedient king, God is promising that he will be and always will be with his covenant people. Now, when we think of the ways that God showed that he was with his people, we know that he said he would be God to Abraham and to his seed. We know that he went with Joseph and Moses, and he told them that they would be his special possession. Now, indeed, if you will be my people and obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all of the peoples, for all of the earth is mine. Marvelous promise. So God showed that he was with Abraham, with Isaac, with Jacob, with Moses, with his people at the foot of Mount Sinai. He even sent the angel of the Lord to go and to guard his people. Exodus chapter 23 and verse 20, behold, I'm going to send an angel before you to guard you along the way and to bring you into the place that I have prepared. And think about how he would speak to Joshua. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. In 2 Samuel 7:9, he says to David, I have been with you wherever you have gone, and have cut off all of your enemies before you, and I will make you a great name, like the names of the great men on the earth. So we can go through and see that God was with specific individuals, but also with his people. But this name, Immanuel, is something deeper. It's a greater revelation, because the glory of God would be revealed on the earth in a remarkable way. During the days of the temple and before that in the tabernacle, the glory of God was hidden. Moses, when he first asked to see the glory of God, was told, no, you can only see my back. And the glory of God dwelled between the cherubim in the Holy of Holies, and the high priest went in, and only once a year. And so this greater manifestation of what it means for God to be with us comes in the person of his Son. Now, that's all comforting and it's wonderful. But it also, unfortunately, in chapter 8, he comes with judgment. And kind of where I want to round up tonight is in verses 8 to 13, where, but the Lord of hosts, him shall you honor as holy. Let him be your fear, let him be your dread, and he will become a sanctuary and a stone of offense, a rock of stumbling to both the houses of Israel, and a trap and a snare to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Really, what he's saying is that Immanuel will be a sanctuary. Now, we know that in ancient times in Israel, Um, they could run to sanctuary and hold on to the horns of the altar, and in later days go into the temple seeking sanctuary. But really, the word sanctuary isn't a place that you run to for physical safety in the Bible. It's a place where God dwells and where you come to worship. It's a place of intimacy. It's a place of living with the presence of God. And so this Immanuel will be one of two things: a sanctuary or a stone of offense or a rock of stumbling. Well, if you read Isaiah, you would assume that the Lord is speaking about himself as the sanctuary, the rock, the stone of offense and the rock of stumbling. But if you go to Romans chapter 9, we read something else. We read, as it is written, and by the way, when we read this, you'll notice that what the Apostle Paul does is to take two verses from Isaiah and put them together. So, behold, I laying a stone in Zion. Now, the verse in chapter 28 is a capstone, a tested and true stone. But here he combines it and he says, as it is written, behold, I lay in Zion a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. And so we have this, just as Ahaz was given a promise or a threat, a promise of deliverance or a promise of judgment, so too all humanity is given a choice. They can turn to God and in the person of his Son and seek salvation. Whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. Whoever believes in him will pass through the judgment unscathed, because God keeps no record of our sin, because our sins have been washed in the shed sacrificial blood of his Son, Immanuel, who demonstrated the depth of the meaning of God with us when he gave his life on the cross. And this is why he and he alone is the decider, or maybe that's not the right word, but he is the one upon which the future destiny of all human lives are based. And so in the judgment seat, there will be one question. And the Lord knows the answer to each and every heart. Have you believed in my Son? Have you been forgiven? And it's such a, for believers, for us, this is such a promise of hope. We are watching Israel very much encircled, as she was in Isaiah's day, by her enemies, with the flood waters, as it were, coming up to her neck, threatening to drown her. But God said, Immanuel, he promised the gift of a son who would demonstrate what it means. And in him alone, he is the rock of stumbling. He's the stone of offense, because there's only the path of the sheep and the goats. You will either go to the right or go to the left. There will either be no record of sin against you, or there will be a long record. And so, fortunately, next week, when we move into the promise of the light, Isaiah is living in dark days. And Isaiah says something that I found really kind of a challenge for where we are today. And he said to me, do not walk in the way of this people. And basically keep away from their conspiracies, keep away from their fears. Because the only person that we should have any fear before is the Lord of hosts. Him shall you honor as holy. Let your fear, let him be your fear, and let him be your dread, and he will become a sanctuary. You see, if our attention is directed to him, he will be our sanctuary. And eventually, at the end, we read that many will stumble on it and shall fall broken in verse 15. And in verse 17, here is Isaiah's challenge to each and every one of us. He says, I will wait for the Lord who is hiding his face from the house of Jacob, and I will hope in him. You see, Isaiah understands what it means to know who his God is, to know what the promises are that have been made by his God to his people. And even though he says, even though you hide your face, yet will I hope in you. Isaiah says in verse 18, I and the children whom the Lord has given me are signs and portents in Israel, from the Lord of hosts who dwells on Zion. And so our challenge as we face days where conspiracy theories abound, where all kinds of spiritualities are enticing young people away from God. And we live in a world where, for those of us who care about Israel, we see her encircled. And so we too must wait, because there is a moment when God says he will bring back his people. There's a moment, he says, when he will deal with Israel. I guess to end, perhaps we should read a verse from Romans 11. Where is it? Here we go. Let's see. The gift and the calling of God, as we know, for Israel is forever. And in verse 26, in this way, all Israel will be saved. As it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will banish ungodliness from Jacob. And as we look at Israel, the Messianic community is still very small. And even though it's growing day by day, it's still small. We haven't yet seen that end time revival of the Jewish people that we long for. And so we want to pray and ask God to turn his face back towards his people. We long for, once again, there to be an outpouring of God's Spirit. And this time, not just on the body of believers in Messiah, but we long for it to be on Israel. And we pray for that day to come. Amen.